For this month's project, I want to talk to you about mixed media, but specifically about the kind of paint you might use. Because in my own work, I like to use different paints, but I use them for their particular properties. So there's always a reason for using one kind of paint rather than another. Now in this video and for this month, I'm going to be talking specifically about three different types of paint. I'm going to be talking about watercolor, and I'm going to be talking about gouache and also acrylic, and why you might like to use all of those paints on the same painting, but also when to use them and the reason for using them at that point. So let's just have a look at some of my previous work, and I'll talk to you about the paint I was using and why I was using it, and then I'll do a little bit of work and talk to you about how it reacts while I'm doing it. I think it's important to know the properties of the paints you use, because then you can decide when to use a particular kind of paint at a particular time, how it's going to react, and it will help you to be creative. It will help you to be able to be experimental and find different effects while you're working, because you understand the properties of the paints and you understand why you might be picking that particular one at this particular moment. So let's just have a look at a couple of my finished paintings from bygone times and then we could just talk about why I was using them and the reason for what I was doing at the time and reason for why I was using them. So this painting here is actually a painting that's on canvas. It's quite a big painting. It's about 1 meter or 90 centimeters or something square on canvas, and it's mostly acrylic. So a lot of the body of the paint is acrylic, and that's how I tend to work, using the properties of the acrylic paint, which is generally a paint that has a fairly heavy body to it. So when you're working with it, when I'm working with it, I don't tend to water it down very much, particularly when I'm working on larger scale pieces like this. I won't water it down too much. I use it reasonably neat out of the tube, because it's kind of designed to be used that way. You can dilute acrylic paint, but it tends to lose its impact if you dilute it too much. I mean, you could make it slightly more fluid if you want to, just by adding a bit of medium or adding a bit of water. But in general, it's best to use it more or less straight out of the tube, because that's kind of what it was designed for. It's high intensity, high viscosity, so it has a really good paint film, strong paint film, which can be really useful because that paint film, being so hard once it's dry, will retain brush marks and will retain texture, so that if you want to have paintings that have pronounced brush marks, you can use acrylic paint to achieve that. So in areas like this down here, where I've got quite a lot of heavy texture, there's a lot of brush marks in there, and it's a bit difficult to see on this picture, but I'll try and find a decent copy of this image where you can kind of zoom into it a little bit. And also up here and underneath, a lot of the underlying layers of this painting will have had quite heavy acrylic brush marks. And because of the properties of the acrylic, like this white under here that you can see, and you can probably see there's quite a bit of texture here in these darker areas. Because of the properties of the acrylic paint, because it dries very stable, and it also dries to retain the texture and retain the brush marks, I've been able to work over it, keeping those brush marks visible, but then working over it. So it doesn't move, and I think that's one of the crucial properties of the acrylic paint, is that once it's dry, it stays where it's put and it doesn't move around. You can scratch into it and scrape at it, but you can't re-wet it and make it move about again. And that, sometimes you can see that as a limitation if the if it's too warm, if you're sketching outside and it's too warm, the paint's drying really, really fast and you're struggling with not being able to move it around like you want to. So like, you know, sometimes that can be a bit of a limitation, but you just kind of have to work with that. But in general, that I see that as a bonus, because if you think about how you're going to use the paint, and the way I use it, is that I want to retain those brush marks. I want to use that acrylic paint to have a nice quick drying time, get some good solid brush marks down that aren't going to move around and I can still work with as I go forward through the painting and build up an interesting paint surface through building up layers of that kind of textured brush mark surface. So that's the acrylic. I mean, that's really why I use the acrylic. The other two types of paint I use are watercolor and gouache. Now, I don't use as much of these paints as the acrylic. It's generally, there's a lot of acrylic and a fair bit of collage in here as well, but I can still talk about this painting in relation to these paints, the watercolor and the gouache, because I did use a fair amount of both of these on this painting. So even though it's a very large painting and it's on canvas, I am still using watercolor and gouache for a particular reason. Because you've got to think about, you know, when would I use the watercolor? So if you think about, okay, so when would I use these paints? Okay, so let's think about the watercolor. If you think about what it is, watercolor. I mean, I don't use it in a traditional watercolor painting way, but it has particular properties which I really enjoy. It's generally, if you get good quality ones, this is an artist quality one, it's like an olive green, but it's high pigment and generally transparent. So those properties can be very, very useful, particularly when you're building up layers. And if you're alternating layers of textural paint with the acrylic and then alternating that with layers of a slightly washier paint, so you want some washy colors in there. So using watered down acrylic isn't as nice for those kind of glazes, if you can call them that. The washing over with thin layers of transparent paint. Watercolor's designed for that. That's what it is. You know, watercolor is a high pigment, semi-transparent or very transparent, depending on the color, water-based paint. So it lends itself really, really well to those kind of building up of layers, alternating textural brush mark layers with the acrylic, and then overlaying that with some washes of watercolor, some nice transparent washes of watercolor, so that you're still seeing all the texture coming through and you can see the layers underneath, but you're getting that kind of glaze effect of colors on top. So that's when I would use watercolor, when I want that effect. Using acrylic for that, for those washes, can work, but I find that it's not as nice. I don't like the look of it. I don't particularly like thin down acrylic. Once you thin it down so much that it has that kind of transparency to it and you can see through to the layers underneath, I think it loses its potency, I suppose. It just becomes a bit dull and it dries very flat as well. If you've got very thin down acrylic paint, it dries very flat, very matte. It's quite deadening. And I don't like to use lots of like glossy mediums, because even though acrylic is, you know, basically acrylic, it's plastic. Because of the way it's formulated, it still has a nice quality. You've got decent quality. Acrylic paint still has a nice quality, and I think a lot of these paint mediums just add loads of this plasticky kind of look to it, particularly gloss mediums. So I don't like to use them at all. So if I'm going to use something for a transparent color that I want to have this kind of wash over the top, watercolor is definitely the way to go, because that is what it's designed to do. It's designed to be a transparent color that retains its color as it dries and still has that kind of nice transparent, translucent quality to it. So, you know, and it's very beautiful paint to work with, and thin down acrylic it's not particularly beautiful to work with. I find it quite unpleasant to work with, in fact. So that's when I would use the watercolor. So what about the gouache? When would I use that? Well, if you think about what gouache is, it's a kind of opaque watercolor. So if I want to use a paint that has the same kind of lovely natural flowing quality of watercolor, but I want something opaque, I want to be able to build it up a little bit and not be able to see through the paint, so I want something opaque deliberately, then gouache is the one for that. Now you could say, I mean, I use a fair amount of white because on here, a lot of this kind of white cloudy area through the painting here was done with this white gouache. And you could say, well, why didn't I just use acrylic for that? You know, you could get a similar kind of look to that with acrylic, and you absolutely could. I could have done this with acrylic. I could have made some thinned down acrylic, white acrylic, and run that through this area and played around with it. You know, got a similar kind of look to it, and that's absolutely true. But I find that the gouache, because of the binder in it, the binder is not plastic. It's not a plastic formula to the binder. It has a much more fluid and natural way of moving when you're putting the paint on. So it's much more pleasant to use. And so I probably did this with the painting flat, laying flat down on a surface. And so I was able to mix up some fairly fluid white gouache and be dripping and running and pushing the paint around the surface. And it just behaves in a really nice, natural way, but also has that lovely kind of opaque quality to it. And I find that's a lot harder to do with acrylic, because when you thin down acrylic, even if it's just a fluid mix, not too thin, not too runny, it doesn't move right. You know, it kind of it doesn't flow in the same way as the gouache. It's just much nicer to use for particular shapes like this. For this kind of flowing cloud shape, I wanted something that had that kind of organic quality to it, and the gouache just works for that. It's a pleasant paint to use. It flows off the brush really nicely. You can move it around. It doesn't dry permanently, and I'll get onto that in a little bit. So yeah, it's just a better fit for that job, and that's what I'm talking about, using these different paints, using, you know, the gouache, using the watercolor, using the acrylic. When I'm using them for specific purposes, using them for the properties that they have. Now, of course, the other thing about gouache and watercolor is that they are not permanent. They don't stick permanently. You can pick them up, you can re-wet them, you can move them around. Now, that is very useful when you're painting, because you put some down, you don't like it, you can re-wet it, you can blot it. So it opens up an awful lot of kind of creative possibilities. Now, I don't have a problem with them not sticking to the painting or being, you know, worried that they're going to come off in future, because generally a painting like this on canvas, it's going to have a final layer of oil paint, and with the oil medium that I use, it's just going to seal everything in. Now, I've had a lot of paintings like this. You think, what about the longevity and things like that? Do all these materials mix well with each other? Well, I think they do, because I've never had a problem with mixing media like this. I've got paintings like this, they're years old. I've got paintings that are much, much older than this, maybe 20, even 30 years old, some of them. And I have no problem with them at all. They don't fall apart, they don't peel off, they don't have any problems. As long as they're looked after, then it's absolutely fine. And like I said, with a layer of oil paint, probably a layer of varnish as well, there's not going to be any problems with them as you go forward. So I don't think you should worry about that. I think you should allow yourself to experiment with the paint and see what happens, and not worry too much about you know, how long they're going to last. But just take, you know, some fairly obvious precautions with the paint. If you're worried that it might peel off, then, you know, do a test area of a painting. If you don't know what you're working on top of, you know, test it out. And you know, I probably don't need to say this, but none of these paints, acrylic, watercolor, gouache, no water-based paint should ever be painted over the top of oil paint or any kind of oil varnish or oil medium, because they won't stick. They just simply won't stick, and they won't last. Okay, it might look okay initially, but it'll just peel off, you know, over time. So yeah, but they're absolutely fine. Water-based paint, working them together, and then you can work over them with some oil paint, some oil medium, or just some varnish, some oil-based varnish. Seals everything in, no problem at all. So just have a look very quickly. I'll just do a couple of little demo pieces that I've got here and just show you how I'm using them. Okay, you've seen me doing this kind of thing before, I'm sure, but I just want to do this now just to kind of just talk about the paint. So, you know, this is just the acrylic paint. So this is one of those little boards I've used in previous sort of demos, but I'm just going to use the paint pretty neat out of the tube, because with a little stiff brush like this one, you can get these really nice pronounced brush marks. Do a bit more paint. And that can be a feature, you know, you can use that and you can think about those brush marks and how you may want to work over them. So it's always good to think, and particularly if you're working in this kind of layering where you're thinking about the paint surface as building up from the original surface of the painting, whether it's gesso or canvas or whatever, and you're building it up towards the top of the final layers, building up these layers. So if you're thinking about working in that way, you have to kind of think a little bit ahead sometimes. So you think, so you know, I'm making these marks on here, just building up some really big, pronounced brush marks with fairly, you know, thick paint. But I'm thinking about what I'm going to do with them later on, because, you know, I don't want just to have a load of white on my painting, but it's really good, like, to get that light tone, particularly when you've got nice darks underneath, so I can get a good contrast between the darks and the lights. But I'm thinking about alternating the layers of paint between having light textural layers, so I've got really good light textural layers, and then I can use my other paints, the more transparent paints, to build up washes of colour on top of that texture. So I'm having alternating these thick, light, textural brush mark layers with thin, washy colour layers. And going backwards and forwards between those two types of layers, you know, once you've got the washy paint on top, you can then work over it again once it's dry. So you're building up this surface from all the way down to the original surface of the board or canvas up to the final layers. And it's a really nice way of working, kind of alternating those two types of paint. So obviously that's going to be wet now, so I'm just going to leave that and just bring this other one in, because this is, you know, it's already got quite a lot of good brush marks on it at the moment. So I can just show you how I use the watercolor on here, how I might use the watercolor on here. Okay, for the watercolor, I'm going to use this quite strong blue so it shows up. And I've got a pan here, you know, obviously with watercolor you can get them in pans or tubes. I've got this nice fresh pan of, I think it's cobalt blue. Let's get lots of material on the brush. And because I've got this nice dry areas here, of nice light dry areas, I can start putting the watercolor on. You know, and it's kind of resisting a little bit with the acrylic that's there. I think I've got some wax crayons or something like that on here, some pastels. But it's quite nice. That kind of resist is quite nice. You can get this very kind of natural areas where the colours just kind of pools in this slightly resisty way that it's doing. But what I also quite like about it is the way that, because it's so fluid, this paint, I'm using quite a bit of the paint, is that you can work back through it very easily, blotting it. I do quite a bit of blotting because it makes it very controllable. But you get these really subtle transitions of colour and tone when you use a paint like this. I clean the brush a little bit. It's like I was saying, you can, because the paint never completely dries. I mean, I haven't really given it much of a chance to dry, but even if it was dry, you would still be able to do this where you can work back through to the light underneath, to the light acrylic underneath. So you get these really, really subtle transitions of colour and tone. And I really like that. I really like this resist effect that you can get. So I can have a real good play around with the different types of effects I can get. So I put some of it down, wiped it back, and where the paint, this watercolour, has gone into these little grooves of the brush marks, that's really nice. That's a nice texture. So I can kind of work it in, but also have this really interesting kind of pooling that you get where the two types of paint are kind of resisting each other. But this will stick though. I mean, you think about, it's not like working over oil paint with a water-based paint. It will stick to it. You'd always be able to pick it up if you didn't varnish it, but it will stick to it. It won't just fall off. Because you think about what watercolour is, the binder for watercolour is gum arabic, and gum arabic is a kind of glue. Really, it's a kind of natural glue. I think it's the gum of the sap of the acacia tree, isn't it? So it's a kind of natural glue, and I think it used to get used for the glue on the back of stamps. So it's, and food additive as well. You can use it as a thickening food additive, but it's a sort of natural glue. So it's sticky. Once it's dry, it's very sticky. Once all the water has evaporated out, it's a very sticky binder. So it will stick really nicely to the surface. I like that. I like that that pooling effect. You get lots of colour on there. Now, the great thing about watercolour is that particularly, you get artist quality ones. You don't have to use masses of it, and it's very powerful, and it doesn't change as it dries. It's going to have that really lovely, intense colour as it dries. So even when the water has evaporated, it will still have the intensity of the colour will remain. So yeah, it's really nice. I really like that. And this kind of it's really just nice to be able to play around with these little shapes. And again, it's very natural. The way it behaves is very natural, and I think that's one of the reasons I like to use the watercolour. And also the gouache, and I'll show you that in a sec. Just have a little play around with that. Can blot some of it. Don't want to take too much of it off because it's quite nice. I like that effect. So yeah, let's have a look at the gouache. I've just got this little lid from a jar because I want something to dilute it slightly in, because you don't really want to be using this neat because it will just crack. It hasn't. It's designed to be fluid. And this is, one of the things you have to think about when you're using these different paints is what are they designed for. It's like with the acrylic paint, is mostly designed to be used neat. You can dilute it, but it's better if you don't. Keep it as neat as possible. Watercolor, obviously, that is designed to be fluid and to be diluted and moved around. You wouldn't scoop some watercolor out and use it in pasto. It's not what it's designed for, so it just won't work. Same with the gouache. It's designed to be used fluid, so it's designed to be diluted. You don't use it neat. It wouldn't dry hard like acrylic. You couldn't use it in pasto because it would never dry. It would just have this kind of soft, flaky texture. It tends to be quite chalky. So you definitely want to be diluting the gouache, and that's how it's going to work the best. So I just put a little bit of water in it just to start it moving around so it can be nice and fluid. That's why I like to put it on a jar, like a little jar lid like this. How's that? Let's try it out. Yeah, that's quite nice. Maybe a little bit more paint. And like I said, I prefer to use this if I want to have a fluid paint that I can push around. And the white is what I use mostly. I do use some of the other colours, like I said, I've got that olivey green. I've got this this Prussian blue. That's a really nice, intense colour. Again, opaque. I think I've got an olive green somewhere as well. I don't use a huge amount of different colours of these. Mostly the white, maybe the green and blue. But again, when I use this, I want to have a paint that I can move around. And I tend to use it like this, very fluid, in this kind of, you know, with the end of the brush, just kind of pushing it around with the end of the brush. And like I said, this is, you know, it's quite opaque, and it has a nice film, nice kind of paint film that you can sort of shift it around. Now, if I were to do this with acrylic, like thin down acrylic paint, it just doesn't move in the same way. It doesn't have this same kind of lovely, fluid, natural quality to it. And this will be opaque as well, so you know I won't be able to see through this once it's dry, once the water's evaporated. And I find this is really good for working into different areas of you know, paintings. What I like to do is sort of find an area like this where there's a shape that's kind of appeared sort of quite naturally where I've been putting the other paint on, and just kind of work into it and sort of reinforce different shapes in the paintings. And it's really nice for that, just kind of subtle little marks that you can make. Let it kind of move and flow. Picking up some of that watercolour as well, which is quite nice. And they play together quite well. You know, you can colour gouache with a bit of watercolour if you want to, you know, change the colour of it. They work together quite well. It's gone quite a pale blue down here now because I've mixed that watercolour. It's quite strong, that watercolour. Used it quite a lot of the pigment. So yeah, so that's really nice to be able to. That's the sort of marks I like to make when I'm using the gouache. You know, if I want to make these kind of fluid, light, moving marks, natural marks, I use the acrylic. And like I said, the gouache, because the acrylic just doesn't move in the same way. Even if you had it diluted like this, because of the binder, because of that kind of plasticky binder, it just doesn't move in the same kind of natural fluid way. So you can make a really nice mark with that just by moving around with the end of the brush. And the other thing that's really good that I find with the gouache, let's just get a little bit more paint, is when you want to get like a kind of stippling effect, if you want to get like that flicky kind of stippled marks on your painting. Again, I find that the gouache works best for that, much better than acrylic. So I've got a really stiff brush here, and you could just try and get some of it on the brush. What I've used in the past actually is an old toothbrush, but I haven't got one at the moment. So I've just got this really stiff brush with some paint on, and I'm just going to flick it like that with my finger to get this kind of really nice stippled effect. It's almost like a kind of fat droplets of paint. It's just one of those practical things that the gouache works really well for, and I find it's better than acrylic, which just doesn't flow off the little stipply brush or toothbrush quite as nicely. So you get a really nice random effect of, you know, different size drops. With the acrylic, it just it tends to froth up a bit when you dilute acrylic. It gets quite frothy. The medium gets frothy. So it just doesn't flow in the same kind of way. Look at that, that's great, isn't it? Kind of just flicking that little, those little marks on those darker areas in particular, maybe into some of the watercolour as well. See what happens. So all this is about thinking about your materials. It's about thinking about the properties that the materials have and how you can best use them to get different effects on your paintings. Yeah, that was just a quick chat about how to use those different types of water-based paint, or moreover how I use them, because obviously there's all sorts of different ways you can use them, particularly with the watercolor. I mean, I'm not using it in a way that, you know, any kind of watercolor purist would think was the proper way to use it. But what I'm thinking about is what properties does it have? You know, it's got those lovely transparent, intense color. That's the properties that I'm looking for in that paint. So I can work over those textural marks underneath. The acrylic, you put it down, and once it's dry, it's not going anywhere. You can do anything, you know, you can work over it, it's not going to move. And the gouache, again, opaque, but very fluid, and it's not permanent. I could pick that back up again, I could wash it off even. And in fact, all that gouache and watercolor, if I didn't like it, I could run it under a tap. Once the acrylic's dry, I could run this under a tap, and all that paint would just come away. So I could start again if I didn't like it. So it's got that flexibility to it, which is really nice, which you couldn't do with acrylic. And again, talking about the permanence of it, obviously this is on a board. Something like this, once it's dry, you could spray some varnish onto it. I don't use acrylic varnish, I'll only use an oil-based varnish. Even with water-based paints, you see them, and they often say on them for oil and acrylic paintings. So it's absolutely fine to use an oil-based varnish on acrylic and water-based paintings. Works really well, and it'll just seal everything in, and it's not going anywhere. So obviously, you know, it has to be super dry first, but I've never had a problem with it. I know it looks a bit odd using these kind of water-based paints that are resisting the surface that's underneath, but literally I've never had a problem with it. Once they're dry and they're varnished, they're absolutely fine. So this is all about experimenting with the properties of your paints. What can they do? What they're designed for? Use them for the purposes that they're designed for. Use them for the properties that they have, and see where it takes you. Okay, that's gonna be a lot of fun. Really looking forward to seeing what you come up with this month, even if they're just experiments. You know, you don't have to think about making some grand painting. Just have a play around with it, play around with the textures, and maybe you've got different types of paints as well, because I know a lot of people have the acrylic inks, which I've never used actually. So I know that's another water-based paint, again with further properties. You can get acrylic gouache. I'm not even sure what that is. Okay, so if anyone's got any of that and they want to have a play around with that and show us, that'd be fantastic. So, you know, think about paints and the properties that they have. They don't just have to be these three, but think about, you know, what you've got and how you can use them to find some creative, interesting marks on your surface. Okay, I'll see you on the group.